Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise this morning to speak of a really terrible tragedy, which is the destruction of environmental law in this country and how it was done in 2012 and how now the current government, despite promises, has failed to repair the damage. I don't enjoy watching a government make mistakes, even if it costs them in the next election. I don't enjoy standing up and saying the Prime Minister promised and now he's broken another promise. It's tragic because we could do better. We used to do better. I will briefly cover the history of environmental assessment in this country and why this bill is not acceptable as it currently stands. Could be made acceptable by accepting a lot of the amendments, particularly those put forward by the member for Edmonton Strathcona and by me. This bill is an omnibus bill that attempts to repair the damage. But first, let's look at what was damaged. Starting back in the early 1970s, the federal government of Canada embarked on a commitment to environmental assessment. We were late. We were later than the U.S. government under Richard Nixon that brought in something called the National Environmental Policy Act, which remains to this day far superior to Canadian law on environmental review. I actually, by fluke, participated in the very first panel review of environmental assessment in Canada in 1976. When I walked into the high school gym in Bedeque, Nova Scotia, I had no idea that this was the first time there'd been a public panel review of a project, but Wreck Cove Hydroelectric on Kipretton Island was the first. I participated in environmental reviews thereafter and as senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment from 1986 to 88, worked with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency and its then head, the late Ray Robinson, on getting permission to take the guidelines order, which was a cabinet order for environmental review, and strengthen it by creating an environmental law, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which was brought in under former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and received royal assent under former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. That bill made it very clear, as did the previous guidelines order from 1973 on, that any time federal jurisdiction was affected, the government had an obligation to do an environmental review. And federal jurisdiction was described since the early guidelines order of the 1970s as federal money, federal land, and any time federal jurisdiction, which was over time narrowed down to decisions made by federal ministers under certain bills, any time those triggers were set off, there had to be at least a cursory screening of the projects. That was the state of environmental law, with many improvements from the early 1970s till 2012. The previous government under Stephen Harper brought in amendments in 2010, and I certainly know that the committee heard from industry witnesses, the Mining Association of Canada in particular, that they thought everything was just about perfect in 2010. There was an attempt to avoid duplication. There was one project, one assessment. There was early screening. There was comprehensive study. Everybody knew what was happening. And then in spring of 2012, the previous government brought in Bill C-38. It was an omnibus bill. It changed 70 different laws in over 430 pages. When the Conservatives complain of lack of consultation in this one, you're right, but you're in a glass house, and anyone who fought C-38 has a huge pile of stones because it didn't have consultation, we didn't have briefings, and they didn't accept a single amendment between first reading and royal assent. That bill repealed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act brought in under former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and what it did was devastate the prospect of any environmental review in this country when federal jurisdiction was impacted, unless it was a big project on a short list. That's the easiest way for me to explain what happened. They changed the triggers by eliminating federal land, federal money, federal jurisdiction, and just said, if it's a big project and this is our short list, then we'll do a review, but we'll exclude most of the public, we'll keep the review fast. And this was a Harper invention that was really diabolical, was to say when it's an environmental assessment of a pipeline, the Environmental Assessment Agency doesn't run that. The National Energy Board will run that. And if it's an environmental assessment of a nuclear project, that'll be run by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And if it's an environmental assessment of drilling in the offshore in Atlantic Canada, if it's off Newfoundland, it'll be the Canada Newfoundland Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board. If it's off Nova Scotia, it'll be the Canada Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board. This collective, which I'll now refer to as the energy regulators, had never played a role in environmental assessment before. They're part of what got broken in C-38. That's why, to my honourable friend from Lakeland, if you want to know why the Kinder Morgan mess is a Kinder Morgan mess, it goes back to handing that assessment to an agency that was incompetent to do it, giving them very short timelines, which forced them to say, we can no longer respect procedural fairness, even for the few interveners we let in the door, because we've got a timeline. So we've got to cut out cross-examination of expert witnesses. We've got to move this thing fast. We're just going to barrel through and ignore most of the evidence because we've got a short timeline. The mess this country is in right now over Kinder Morgan can be laid directly at the door of Bill C-38 in spring 2012. Now, this bill should have repaired all that damage. That was the promise of the Liberal platform. That was the commitment in the mandate letter to ministers. And what do we have now? We have an omnibus bill that deals with the impact assessment piece, deals with the National Energy Board, now renamed the Canadian Energy Regulator, and deals with the disaster that happened in Bill C-45 in the fall of 2012 when they gutted the Navigable Waters Protection Act. So 3 pieces of legislation that are very fundamental to environmental law in this country and energy policy. They all need fixing, but they shouldn't have been fixed in one omnibus bill. I completely agree with the member for Lakeland that this was forced through committee, but it was also forced through the wrong committee. The environmental assessment piece should have gone to the Environment Committee, but the NEB/Canadian Energy Regulator piece should have gone to the Natural Resources Committee, and the Navigable Waters Protection Act piece should have gone to the Transport Committee. This omnibus bill in front of us, Bill C-69, has been inadequately studied, despite what I have to say were heroic efforts from the chair of the Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. She did a great job. The committee members from the government side worked really hard to improve this bill, but none of us had enough time. We had a deadline, a hammer fell at 9 o'clock at night on the last chance to look at it. By 12:30 in the morning, most of the amendments that were accepted were never debated before the committee, much less adequately studied. So, Madam Chair, it is a tragedy. Here's how Harper Think has survived and owns C-69 in terms of environmental assessment. We have not restored the triggers. Federal funding of a project no longer triggers an environmental review, full stop. Federal lands still do, but federal jurisdiction, decisions made by the Minister of Fisheries on the Fisheries Act don't trigger an environmental assessment. Decisions made by the Minister of Transportation under the Navigable Waters Act don't trigger an environmental assessment. It'll be, again, the short list of big projects, which we still haven't seen because it's under consultation. So the triggers are inadequate. The scope of the reviews will move from pre-2012 about 4,000 to 5,000 projects a year being at least given a cursory review to the current situation that was left to us, bequeathed to us by the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, of a couple dozen a year. As well, the Liberals promised, and it was definitely the advice of the expert panel, I should have mentioned 2 expert panels, one on the NEB, one on environmental assessment, huge consultations. Probably Liberal speeches will reference the enormous level of consultation that took place before this bill came out. It needs to be said on the record that the advice of the expert panels was ignored in both cases. In terms of environmental assessment, what was ignored was the call to go back to the same triggers we'd had since 1974. Federal land, federal money, federal jurisdiction. They didn't pay attention to that recommendation. The recommendation that it be a single agency they claim to have taken into account. But when you read the bill, it says the Impact Assessment Agency, when it sets out a panel review, if it's a pipeline, you have to bring on board members of the Canadian Energy Regulator, which was the NEB, to be on that panel. More egregiously, Madam Chair, despite amendments accepted in committee, the government has rejected the one that says if it's the Canada Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board or the Canada Newfoundland Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board, those members of the panel can also sit as chairs. Only in those 2 instances were the amendments accepted at committee, rejected by this government. And those boards were created by statute with the mandate to expand offshore oil and gas. This bill is so bad that after decades of fighting for environmental assessment, I have to vote against it. And that's why it's tragic, because I could break down right now and weep for the loss of decades of experience. We know better than this.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the comments from the member from Saanich Gulf Islands. She's extremely passionate about this particular topic, as we know, and I will not question her wisdom in terms of the information that she brings to the table in regards to this debate. I will say that, you know, when the Liberal Party ran in the last election, Madam Speaker, we had a lot of concerns over the way that things were previously being done with respect to the way that we were engaging with our environmental commitments. I know that she is concerned about the fact that 3 bills are being merged into one here, and she's expressed her desire to vote against the motion or the bill, but would she not at least, you know, I'm interested to get her comments more, instead of drilling down into particular items, but more holistically looking at all of it. Would she not at least agree that this bill is better than what we had before in terms of its commitment to providing the necessary safeguards that we need to protect our environment?
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a tough question. I heard the Minister of Finance, when he announced that we were buying a 65-year-old pipeline, claim that the Kinder Morgan Environmental Review was the most, quote-unquote, the most rigorous environmental review in this country's history. It is, in point of fact, the worst. The very worst environmental review in Canada's history was the one the NEB did on Kinder Morgan. And I've been involved in dozens of these reviews. It's not hyperbole. I think it's a fact. Anybody in environmental law would tell you that. Is this somewhat better than what Harper left in place? Maybe. But here's the problem. If you accept a fundamental review of this many acts now in 2018, we won't get this fixed for another decade. And this bill stinks. So I have to vote against it.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Saanich Gulf Islands for her very pertinent remarks, as they always are. She is a wealth of information. I'm wondering if she observed or saw another parallel between the previous Conservatives government and the Liberal position. Now that we're seeing this craze of giving increasing powers to the minister. In this bill, C-69, we see a difficult solution, but one where the Minister of the Environment can sidestep anything as she sees fits.
Saanich Gulf Islands.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands. I'd like to thank my colleague for his comments. I agree with him fully. It's clear that in Bill C-69, the Minister of the Environment, for that part of, under that part of the omnibus bill, has more discretional power, and I hope that I'm using the proper terminology in French. She has discretionary powers, but with the amendments we are attempting to provide more guidance. However, this remains a bill where ministerial authority has increased. There's a lack of clarity and regulations that need to be put in place.
Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for St. John's East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and obviously I'd like to thank the member for Saanich Gulf Islands for her views on this topic. They're informed and important. From Newfoundland and Labrador, you know, I think most Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are very proud of the Atlantic Accord. They appreciate the role the life cycle regulator plays, and we understand that when the regulator says no, they say no, but they don't just say yes, they say how. And so why does the member not feel that the life cycle regulator has an important role to play in setting conditions at the impact assessment stage?
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands, a brief answer, please.
Well, we know that the expert panel recommended they not play a role. I've watched. I mean, it's absolutely true. The Canada, Newfoundland, Labrador Offshore Patrolling Board, I know Newfoundlanders are very proud of it. But it has a mandate in law to expand offshore oil and gas. And with all due respect, how on earth can it be seen to be unbiased when looking at a project to expand offshore oil and gas? This is the clearest example of an inappropriate allocation of review processes and review powers to any agency in Canada's history.